Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. If you feel fear, you should like and subscribe this channel. So, let's go. The hum of the tires on the asphalt was a constant, like the steady beat of a drum. It had been a long day, and I was tired just trying to get home. My eyes kept flickering back to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see another car, some sign of life on this deserted stretch of road, but there was nothing. Just the fog. Just me. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. Maybe I was imagining it. But something felt off. It wasn't just the quiet. It was too quiet, even for the middle of nowhere. I glanced at the time. It was past midnight. A sudden flash of light in the mirror made me jump. My heart skipped a beat as I slammed my foot on the gas, trying to get a better look. A set of headlights, but there was nothing there. The road behind me was as empty as it had been a moment ago. I breathed out, trying to shake off the tension. Maybe it was just a trick of the fog, a fleeting reflection. But my mind kept drifting back to that flash. Had someone been following me? I turned the corner, my headlights flickering slightly, and for a split second I thought I saw something standing by the side of the road. A figure, tall and thin, just standing there, barely visible in the mist. I slammed the brakes, the car skidding slightly as my heart raced. I quickly looked again, but there was nothing, just the empty road. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself it was just a shadow, a trick of my tired eyes. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced into the rearview mirror again, but the road was clear. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. Then the headlights flashed again. This time, it was right behind me. I gasped and looked over my shoulder. There was nothing. No car, no light, just darkness. But I wasn't imagining the feeling. The air in the car had grown heavy, oppressive, like something was closing in around me. My breath quickened and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing against my chest. I sped up, heart hammering in my chest. The road ahead was a blur of gray and black. The fog seemed to grow thicker the farther I went, but I didn't dare slow down. Something was wrong. A few miles down the road, I saw a faint light ahead. The glow of another set of headlights. This time, it wasn't in the mirror. It was coming straight at me. I pulled the wheel sharply, my tires screeching as I swerved to avoid the car. But when I glanced to the side, there was no vehicle in sight. I was alone on the road again. My hands were shaking. I couldn't understand. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? Was I just exhausted, seeing things? Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the car, the sound of something slamming into the passenger side. I whipped my head around, but there was no one there. I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The headlights behind me were still there, too close, too constant, but I didn't dare look in the mirror again. As I neared the next turn, the fog thickened again, and the road twisted ahead. It felt as though the trees were closing in on me, the dark shapes looming like sentinels. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something just beyond the fog, waiting. I tried to turn on the radio again, desperate for some kind of distraction, but it only hissed with static. The headlights behind me suddenly flickered, and in that moment, the entire world seemed to stop. The car in my mirror was gone, just like that. I glanced at the road ahead and saw nothing but the thick, swirling fog. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the entire thing. But then, I heard it. A knock. The sharp sound came from the passenger side window. It echoed in the silence like a whisper, sending chills down my spine. My hands froze on the steering wheel. I looked to the side, and through the mist, I saw something. A face, pale and blurred, staring back at me from the other side of the glass. Nearly screamed, but no sound came out. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, not daring to look again. The fog was thick now, almost suffocating. I could barely see a few feet ahead, but I kept driving. Faster, harder, not stopping until I reached the first sign of civilization. By the time I pulled into a gas station a few miles down the road, my hands were slick with sweat. I was trembling all over. I looked around, half expecting to see someone standing there, waiting for me. But there was no one. The place was empty, just a small, desolate station at the edge of nowhere. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. Whatever had happened, it was over. But as I stepped out of the car, I froze. I saw it just for a moment, a flash of light in the rearview mirror. And then, nothing. I was driving back home after a long, exhausting week. It was late, too late, actually, the kind of late where even the streetlights seem tired and the world outside feels suspended in a dull, endless void. The road I was on was a winding, two-lane highway through the woods, one of those roads that everyone knows is a shortcut but only drives on when they're feeling brave. Or foolish. It was just me, the hum of my car's engine, and the steady white line flashing beneath my tires as the clock in the dashboard ticked past midnight. I should have taken the longer route. I knew better. There were no other cars. The headlights of my car barely cut through the dense trees that lined both sides of the road. Occasionally, a deer would dart across the asphalt, its eyes glowing in the headlights before vanishing into the underbrush. The air felt thick. Not just outside, it was in the car too. I rolled down the window to get some fresh air, but the breeze that came in was cold, damp, and unsettling. It didn't feel natural. It felt wrong. But I shrugged it off. I kept driving, and that's when I first saw her. She was standing by the side of the road, half hidden in the shadow of the trees. I couldn't see her clearly at first, but there was something about the way she stood, frozen, unmoving, that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I slowed down instinctively. She was wearing a long white dress, the kind that seems too old-fashioned, too out of place for the modern world. Her hair was long and dark, hanging limp around her face. But her face, it wasn't just pale. It was empty, hollow, like something had drained the life out of it. I glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing, no other cars. I looked at the clock, 12:34 a.m. Was I imagining this? I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. My foot hovered over the brake pedal, but I kept going, telling myself she was just another hitchhiker, maybe in trouble. There had to be a logical explanation. But something told me to keep driving, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me. A few minutes later, I glanced in the mirror again, and my heart nearly stopped. She was there, in my rearview mirror. But she wasn't standing by the side of the road anymore. She was walking down the highway, following me. Her figure, faintly illuminated by my taillights, was moving far too quickly for someone in that kind of dress, in that kind of eerie, unnatural stillness. I slammed my foot on the accelerator. The engine roared, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The car sped forward, the headlights casting long, eerie shadows. The road stretched ahead like a never-ending tunnel, and I was trapped in it. My mind raced. I should pull over, call someone, but who could I even call? It was midnight in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't shake the thought. If I stopped, I would never leave. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, knuckles white. I was speeding now, my car careening down the road, but I couldn't look away from the rearview mirror. She was still there, still following. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the mind, a reflection. But the feeling of her presence grew stronger. I could sense it. She was getting closer. I glanced ahead. The road stretched on endlessly. No signs of civilization, no exits. Just miles and miles of trees. There was nowhere to turn off, nowhere to stop. Suddenly, a sharp knock sounded on the side of the car, the passenger window. I gasped, heart nearly leaping out of my chest. My eyes shot to the passenger side. Nothing. There was no one there, just the empty night air and the dark trees passing by. I dared a quick look back at the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. Her face. Right behind me, her pale, lifeless face was pressed up against the glass of the back window, her long, dark hair tangled and floating like a veil in the wind. I screamed and swerved the car, almost losing control, but somehow I kept it steady. The road blurred before me, the trees nothing but shadowed shapes now, and the girl, she was gone. I floored the accelerator, speeding through the night, unable to stop myself. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I don't know. It felt like an eternity. The shadows in the trees no longer seemed like trees. The road felt like it stretched on forever. I wasn't sure when I left the woods behind or when the lights of the city began to flicker on the horizon. All I knew was that when I finally pulled into a gas station, I was shaking uncontrollably, drenched in sweat. I parked the car, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. But when I looked back, nothing. No figure. No pale, lifeless face staring at me through the glass. The world outside was quiet. I don't know what happened. I don't know if it was real or if I imagined it all. But I never took that road again. And if you ever find yourself driving through the woods at night, don't stop. Just keep going. Because sometimes the things you can't see are the ones you should fear the most. The road stretched ahead, an endless ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the night. The headlights of my car cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty highway. It was just past midnight, and I was on my way home from visiting my parents. The drive was long, and the silence of the night settled heavy around me. I had driven this route countless times before, but something about tonight felt different. The air seemed thicker, the shadows darker. Even the hum of my engine felt oddly distant, as if the world beyond my car didn't quite exist. Then I saw him. A lone figure stood on the side of the road, just at the edge of the headlight's reach. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the night. He didn't wave, didn't move, just stood there, watching. A chill crawled up my spine. I wasn't sure why, but something about him felt wrong. As I passed, I caught a glimpse of his face. Pale, expressionless. His eyes followed my car, unblinking. I exhaled sharply. Just some hitchhiker, I told myself. Nothing unusual, but my hands were gripping the wheel a little too tightly. I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was gone. A cold shiver ran through me. There was no way he could have moved that fast. The road was straight, nothing but open space behind me, but the spot where he had stood was empty. I swallowed hard and pressed the accelerator. The road stretched on, endless and silent. I turned on the radio to shake the unease, but only static filled the speakers. Strange. Then my headlights flickered. For a second, the world went dark. When the lights returned, he was standing in the middle of the road. I gasped, slamming the brakes. The car screeched to a stop, the seatbelt cutting into my chest. My hands trembled as I looked ahead. But he wasn't there. The road was empty. My breathing was ragged. My heart pounded so hard it echoed in my ears. I forced myself to keep driving, my hands ice cold on the wheel. The next few miles passed in tense silence. My mind screamed at me to just get home. The road signs were familiar now. Only 20 minutes left. I could make it. Then, out of the corner of my eye, movement. I turned my head. He was sitting in my back seat. I let out a strangled gasp, my entire body going cold. I swerved instinctively, the tires screeching against the pavement. I blinked, heart pounding. The seat was empty. I was alone. I forced a shaky breath, my entire body trembling. I didn't dare look in the mirror again. I didn't dare slow down. Just drove, faster, faster. Finally, the lights of my town appeared on the horizon. Relief washed over me. I turned onto my street, nearly shaking as I pulled into my driveway. I cut the engine, breathing hard. For a moment, I sat there, gripping the wheel. The night was silent again. Normal. Safe. Then, just as I reached for the door handle, a whisper right behind me. "You should have kept driving." I didn't look back. I bolted from the car, rushed inside, and locked the door behind me. The next morning, when I finally worked up the nerve to check my car, the back seat was wet, as if someone had been sitting there. It was just another late-night drive. I'd been working a shift at the hospital, and by the time I got in my car, the roads were empty and quiet. The headlights cut through the fog that had rolled in, and the only sound was the hum of my tires against the pavement. I should have felt tired, but there was something about driving alone in the dark that kept me alert. The clock on my dashboard flashed 2:42 a.m. as I cruised down the deserted highway. The world outside was cloaked in darkness, save for the occasional flicker of distant lights from passing trucks. My mind wandered, as it often did during these solitary drives, until the faintest movement caught my eye in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just another car, but there were no other headlights behind me, nothing in the mirror except for the darkness of the road. I shook it off. It's probably just the fog playing tricks on me, I thought. But a few moments later, the sensation hit me. I was being followed. I glanced back again. The dim, white glow of headlights shone faintly in the distance, so far away that it couldn't possibly be right behind me. But it felt too close, too deliberate. My heartbeat quickened as I pressed my foot a little harder on the gas pedal. I drove for miles, the car behind me staying at the exact same distance. Not once did I hear it accelerate or decelerate. It was as though it was matched perfectly with my speed, an invisible presence creeping up on me. I cursed under my breath. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I had heard stories about night drives playing tricks on your mind, but the feeling of being watched was becoming unbearable. I glanced at my side mirror, expecting to see headlights blinding me, but there was only darkness. The car was gone. My shoulders relaxed for a split second. Okay, maybe it was just a figment of my imagination. I looked ahead and tried to focus on the road, but a shiver crept up my spine. That's when I saw it. Just up ahead, through the misty haze, a figure stood by the side of the road. A man, motionless, dressed in tattered clothes. He didn't seem to belong there. Not at this hour, not on this stretch of road, far from any town or gas station. I slowed down involuntarily. What was he doing there? As I got closer, the figure didn't move. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel the weight of his gaze. My stomach twisted. There was no way I was stopping. No way I was rolling down the window to ask if he needed help. I had heard enough stories to know better. I pressed my foot to the pedal, wanting to get past him as quickly as possible. But when I looked back in the rearview mirror, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was now standing right in the middle of the road facing me. There was no way he could have gotten there that fast. I was moving at a steady speed, and there had been no other cars around. I was sure I had passed him a second ago. I could see the outline of his shape clearly now, just standing there, still, watching. I slammed my foot on the gas, the engine roaring as the car surged forward. But the figure didn't move. It didn't blink. The headlights illuminated him fully for a brief moment before I passed. And then, nothing. I glanced back, my heart racing. The road behind me was empty again. No figure, no sign of anyone. It was as if he had melted into the fog. I told myself it was just some stranger out for a late-night walk. maybe even some hitchhiker who had disappeared into the night, but my gut told me that wasn't it, that something was off. My mind raced. Was I imagining it? Was this the kind of thing you see after too many hours on the road? Maybe, but it didn't feel like that. It felt wrong. I didn't want to stop, but my hands were trembling. I tried to steady my grip on the wheel, but the chill creeping through my body wouldn't go away. The mist had thickened as I kept driving, the road now barely visible. I flicked the headlights to high beam, but it didn't help much. I drove on, desperate for a sign of life. A gas station, an exit, anything. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those same headlights or the outline of that figure. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, a sign appeared on the side of the road. Welcome to Riverton. I breathed a sigh of relief. The town was just a few miles ahead, and I knew it would be well lit and full of people. I wouldn't feel so isolated anymore. I reached the first intersection, and as I slowed down to turn onto a well-lit road, I glanced in the rearview one. Last time. The headlights were back, but this time they were closer. Not behind me, but alongside my car, keeping pace. They weren't in the lane next to me. They were just there, floating next to my car, moving in unison with me. I slammed the brakes, heart pounding. The headlights were gone, just like that. The road was empty again. Not a single car in sight. I drove the rest of the way into town, never once glancing back. It was one of those drives that started like any other, just me, my car, and the long stretch of road ahead. I had been visiting a friend, a few hours away from home, and now I was on my way back. The highway stretched for miles, and it was late, way past midnight. The headlights of my car sliced through the inky blackness, casting long shadows that seemed to follow me. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you realize how alone you are. The road was familiar, but tonight it felt different. The trees along the side of the highway seemed closer than usual, their limbs clawing at the sky. Every so often, a small animal darted across the road, its eyes reflecting in the headlights for a split second before vanishing into the darkness. Turned the radio on, hoping for some company. The static crackled for a moment before a faint voice came through, garbled and distant. I adjusted the knob to clear the noise, but then the voice was gone, replaced by the empty hiss of static. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but the longer I drove, the more it felt like something was watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up and a cold chill washed over me, though the air was warm outside. I glanced into the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, just the faint glow of my headlights spilling onto the asphalt, stretching out into the distance. I kept driving, but the feeling didn't fade. It only grew stronger. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A figure standing at the side of the road. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure how I hadn't seen it before. I slowed down, my foot hovering over the brake. The figure didn't move, just stood there, completely still, in the shadows. It was a person. Tall, thin, with a hood that covered most of their face. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline against the dark backdrop of trees. I considered stopping. Maybe they needed help, but something told me to keep driving. Something unnatural about them made my stomach turn. As I passed, I stole another glance at the figure, and that's when I saw it. Their eyes, wide, unblinking, and completely black. I nearly swerved off the road. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move as I sped past, but I could feel its presence, watching, following. My breath was ragged and I didn't dare look back. The road ahead seemed endless now. My headlights illuminated the blackness, but I felt it creeping in from all sides. The feeling of being pursued, of being followed, pressed down on me, making the air feel thick and suffocating. I checked the rearview mirror again. For a moment, I saw nothing, just the faint reflection of my own face. But then I caught a flicker, a shadow, not from the trees, not from the road, moved. It was in the reflection of my mirror, darting across the rear window. I jerked the wheel to the side, swerving slightly, but when I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone. My hands were sweaty on the steering wheel. I was driving faster. Now, the engine roaring beneath me as I pushed the car to its limits. The headlights seemed to falter for a moment, as though the dark was swallowing them whole. And then I saw it again. The figure, standing just off the shoulder of the road, still, unblinking, watching. This time, I didn't even slow down. I couldn't. My foot was firmly on the accelerator, my grip tightening around the wheel. But as I flew past, I heard something. A voice, faint but clear, cutting through the night like a whisper in my ear. Stop. It was as if the sound was right beside me, but there was no one in the car. I looked at the passenger seat, half expecting to see someone sitting there, but of course there was no one. I was completely alone. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I drove faster and faster, the road twisting ahead like a never-ending black ribbon. My breath was coming in short, panicked bursts now. The world outside the car blurred as I pushed the speedometer. Higher. Then a loud bang. Something hit the side of the car. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. The night was silent once more. I sat there, shaking, staring at the empty road ahead. The figure was gone. The voice had stopped. Everything was still. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it a trick of the light? A hallucination from exhaustion? I took a deep breath and put the car in gear, my hands still trembling as I drove the rest of the way home. The road behind me was empty. But the feeling didn't leave. As I pulled into my driveway, I glanced at the rearview mirror one last time. And there, for just a fleeting moment, I saw those eyes, black, unblinking, staring. I'd been on the road for hours, the clock on the dashboard reading just after midnight. I had just left my friend's house after a late night, the town now far behind me, and the only light was from my headlights cutting through the pitch-black night. I had taken this route 100 times before, the road winding through the dense woods and open fields with no towns in sight for miles. But tonight, something felt off. At first, it was just a subtle feeling, a nagging unease in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't explain. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me. There was nothing, just darkness, but still, the feeling wouldn't go away. The road was empty. No cars, no other lights. I turned the radio down to a low hum. The only sound now was the occasional rustling of the trees in the wind, like whispers coming from the woods on either side of me. That's when I saw it. A figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by the trees. But then it moved. It was standing by the side of the road, just past the edge of my headlights. A person. A woman. She was wearing a long white dress, her hair wild and unkempt, blowing in the wind. She didn't move when I passed by, and I couldn't make out her face, but I felt a cold chill rush over me as I drove past. My stomach turned. Something about her felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I shook my head, trying to brush off the feeling. It's just your mind playing tricks, I muttered to myself, but my hands were starting to sweat on the steering wheel. But then, just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, I looked in the rearview mirror again. She was gone. For a brief moment, I thought I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just the shadows. But then I saw it again, a flicker of movement. My heart skipped a beat. The woman was now standing in the middle of the road, directly behind my car. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the asphalt as I tried to avoid her. The car jerked forward, the headlights flashing briefly in her direction before I came to a complete stop. I stared at the empty road behind me. Nothing. I sat there, frozen for a moment, heart pounding in my chest. I considered getting out of the car, but that felt insane. My mind raced, thinking of every possible explanation. A hitchhiker, maybe? Someone lost in the woods? But there was no one, no sign of movement, only the eerie stillness of the night. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a trick of the light, some weird optical illusion. I shifted the car into drive, pressing the gas pedal gently. The engine hummed to life, and I pulled forward, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. And there she was, right behind me. This time, much closer. Her figure was unmistakable. The long white dress, the wild hair, the pale skin that seemed to glow in the darkness. She was walking slowly, her footsteps soft but deliberate, following me down the road. I gasped, my grip tightening on the wheel. I wasn't imagining this. She was real. And she was getting closer. My thoughts raced. Was she trying to get my attention? Was she lost, or was this something else entirely? I looked around, but the road was still completely empty. No houses, no lights, just the dark woods pressing in on either side. I hit the gas harder, trying to get away, but the woman stayed with me. No matter how fast I went, no matter how much I accelerated, she kept up. The sound of her footsteps was growing louder now, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around and look directly at her. My mind was fighting against the fear, but the unease was suffocating. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. She was still there, but now she was smiling. I couldn't breathe. My heart was thumping painfully in my chest. I could feel her presence behind me, but I refused to look again. I just kept driving, faster and faster. Finally, just as I felt like I was losing my mind, I reached a bend in the road. I turned it sharply, the tires screeching once again, and as I did, I dared to glance at the rearview mirror one last time. She was gone. No figure in the road. No pale woman. Nothing but the empty night stretching out behind me. I didn't stop to take another look. I didn't even slow down. I floored it all the way home, never letting up on the accelerator. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I could still feel the weight of her gaze, like she was still there, just outside of my vision. The next morning, I drove the same road again, but there was nothing there. No woman in the white dress. No sign of anything out of the ordinary. I never mentioned it to anyone. I couldn't explain what had happened. But that night, on that lonely road, I had the distinct feeling I wasn't alone. It had been a long day, and I was eager to get home. The highway stretched before me like a dark ribbon, illuminated only by the occasional flicker of my headlights. It was late, too late, and I was the only car on the road. That's when the weirdness began. It was around midnight when I noticed the first sign. A shadow, just beyond the reach of my headlights, seemed to move. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or maybe an animal darting across the road. But when I glanced back, there was nothing. The road was empty, and the forest on either side was still as death. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. "You're just tired," I muttered to myself. "It's nothing." But even as I said it, the feeling didn't go away. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and the silence was so deep it almost felt suffocating. The only sound was the hum of my tires on the asphalt. Then I saw something else. A car, far behind me. Its headlights were so dim I could barely make out its shape, but there was no mistaking it. It was there, trailing me at a slow, constant pace. I wasn't exactly worried at first. Maybe it was just another driver making the late-night journey home. I kept my speed, my hands gripping the wheel a little tighter. But as the minutes passed, the car never seemed to get any closer. It was like it was always just far enough behind, matching my pace. I glanced into my rearview mirror again. Still there. Maybe they're in a hurry too, I told myself, but the pit in my stomach was growing. The road ahead was dark, and the farther I drove, the more oppressive the silence became. I checked the mirror again. The car was closer now. Not by much, but enough to make me uneasy. Okay, that's enough, I muttered under my breath, my heart beginning to race. Let's just speed up. I pressed the gas pedal harder, pushing my car to 45 miles per hour. But when I glanced back again, the car behind me was still at the same distance. Impossible. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just a coincidence. Maybe they were stuck in a trance-like drive too, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Another glance at the rearview mirror. The car was now closer. Much closer. I jerked the wheel and swerved to the side, pulling off, onto the shoulder. The other car followed suit, its headlights flaring brighter as it pulled in behind me. I stopped the car completely and waited, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I expected. Maybe a man, a woman, someone in need of help. But after what felt like an eternity, the other car's headlights shut off. The darkness seemed to swallow the road. I sat in my car, breath held. The stillness was unbearable, and my hands were cold against the steering wheel. What the hell was going on? After what seemed like forever, I finally dared to look out the window. But when I did, my blood ran cold. There, in the distance, was the other car, parked in the middle of the road. There was no one inside. The headlights were off, and it was completely still. No one had gotten out. Nothing moved. I swallowed hard, panic rising in my throat. Should I leave? Should I get out and check? My mind screamed at me to drive, to just get away from whatever this was. But just as I reached for the gear shift, I saw something else. A figure. It appeared from the woods not far from the car. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but then it stepped closer to the road, its form becoming clearer. A tall figure covered in what looked like tattered clothing, but the face was hidden. A hood, or maybe hair, obscured it entirely. I froze, my breath coming in quick gasps. The figure just stood there, staring at me. Even from this distance, I could feel its gaze, cold and unmoving. I had no idea how long I stared back at it. It felt like time had stopped. My heart was racing, and I could hear it pounding in my ears. There was no way to explain it. This wasn't a person. This was something else. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the accelerator, swerving back onto the road, my tires screeching as I sped away. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I drove faster than I ever had before. My headlights cutting through the dark, the trees flashing by in a blur. The figure never followed. When I finally reached the nearest town, I parked in a gas station lot and sat there for a long time, hands still trembling on the wheel. I wanted to believe it was nothing, a bad case of fatigue or a trick of the road. But deep down, I knew what I had seen, and I knew one thing for sure. I was never driving a stretch of highway again. The night was pitch black when I started my drive home. It was around 11 p.m. and the highway stretched endlessly in front of me, the only sound in the car being the hum of the tires on the asphalt. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty road ahead. I had just left my friend's house after a long weekend visit, and the drive felt eerily quiet, like the world had fallen asleep and I was the only one awake. The road was familiar. I'd driven it countless times before, but tonight it felt different. The trees that lined the highway seemed to loom closer, their dark branches reaching out like fingers, casting long shadows across the road. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to ignore it. The radio crackled softly, nothing but static, and I reached to turn it off. As I did, the headlights flickered. I slammed my hand on the steering wheel a bit too hard, cursing under my breath. Great. Just what I need, I muttered. But then, I saw it. In the distance, just outside the reach of my headlights, there was a figure standing on the side of the road. A person. I slowed down, squinting, trying to make sense of it. It was a woman, dressed in a long, flowing white dress, her hair falling over her shoulders, standing perfectly still. She was facing the road, but her head was tilted, almost as if she was looking at something or someone. A shiver ran down my spine. The night was far too cold for someone to be out there, especially dressed like that. I slowed the car even further as I approached, my heart pounding now. What was she doing out here alone? Was she in trouble? I reached for my phone, thinking I should call someone, maybe the authorities. But as I looked back at her, I noticed something strange. Her eyes. She wasn't looking at the road at all. She was staring directly at my car. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't explain why, but the feeling of her gaze on me made my skin crawl. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her, even as I slowly rolled past her. And then, just as I reached the point where the headlights could no longer reach her, she moved. Not quickly, but just enough to make me jump. She turned her head, slowly, following the car with her eyes. I didn't stop to think. My foot slammed on the gas and I sped past her, not daring to look back. The eerie sensation of her gaze stayed with me, though. It was like she was watching me, still, even though I was already far down the road. Minutes passed, but the unsettling feeling didn't fade. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me, or her figure standing in the distance, watching, but nothing. The road was empty, or so I thought. After another 5 minutes or so, the headlights flickered again. This time, the car in front of me seemed to disappear. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but when I looked again, there was nothing, just a stretch of empty road behind me, stretching out into the darkness. Okay, this is getting ridiculous, I muttered to myself, trying to stay calm. I focused on the road, but that nagging feeling, the sensation of being watched, crept over me again. It was then that I saw something in the rearview mirror, a shadow. At first, it looked like the silhouette of a person, standing in the middle of the road. I blinked, but when I looked again, it was gone. My heart started racing. What was going on? I had to be seeing things. But then, the headlights flickered again. I looked in the rearview mirror once more. This time, I was sure of what. I saw the woman. She was there, not on the side of the road, but in the middle of the highway, walking slowly toward me. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The car jerked to a halt. My hands were shaking. I wasn't sure if it was a trick of the light, if I was dreaming, or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but there she was, slowly walking toward my car, the same white dress flowing around her ankles. She wasn't moving fast. Her steps were deliberate, as if she was in no hurry. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare honk the horn or call out. I just sat there, staring, unable to look away. Then, as I watched her approach, something inexplicable happened. The headlights flickered once more, and in the blink of an eye, she was gone. Just like that. I waited, counted the seconds. I wasn't sure what was happening, but when I looked around, there was no sign of her. The road was empty again. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered enough courage to drive away. I didn't stop to check. I didn't dare. I just drove, fast. As I drove, the feeling of being watched didn't fade, but I didn't look back. I couldn't, and I never drove that road again. It was late, too late, really, but I was determined to make it home. The road stretched endlessly ahead, winding through thick woods. I'd taken the back route to avoid traffic, but now that the sun had dipped below the horizon, I was starting to regret it. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating only a few feet of the asphalt ahead. The shadows in the trees seemed to swallow everything else. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:42 a.m. The drive had been peaceful at first, the kind of quiet that settles in after midnight, where the world feels still, almost weightless. But as I passed the old abandoned gas station, something shifted. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the sudden feeling I wasn't alone. "Stop being ridiculous," I muttered to myself, gripping the wheel tighter. It was just the silence of the night playing tricks on me. The wind outside picked up, rattling the car's windows. The forest seemed to lean in closer, the trees pressing in on both sides. Every now and then, I could see something, maybe an animal, or maybe just a trick of the light, darting through the shadows just beyond the reach of my headlights. I knew I should keep my eyes on the road, but I couldn't help but glance into the dark woods. A faint sound broke the quiet, a soft thud. I froze, instinctively slamming the brakes. The car slowed to a crawl, the tires crunching over gravel. I stared into the rearview mirror, but all I saw was the same black expanse of road behind me. Nothing, just the occasional flicker of light from the moon. I shook my head, scolding myself for being jumpy. I pressed the gas pedal again and the car lurched forward, the engine humming steadily. Then I heard it again. Thud. This time, louder and closer. I slammed my foot on the brakes. The car skidded slightly before coming to a stop, my heart pounding in my chest. A chill ran down my spine. I was alone on this stretch of road, miles from the nearest town, with nothing but the trees and the night to keep me company. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching me from the darkness. I took a deep breath, staring into the rearview mirror, waiting for something to move. A shadow. A figure. Nothing. I started the car. Again, my hands now gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. As I drove forward, I couldn't help but notice that the road seemed different. The trees felt closer, as though they were creeping in on me. The night, too, felt heavier, denser, pressing against the sides of my car. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, standing on the side of the road. I jerked my gaze toward it, but it was gone. I blinked, trying to shake off the unease gnawing at my insides. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a figment of my tired mind. But no, there was something strange about it. The figure had been too tall, too still, and there had been no sound of footsteps. It had just appeared. I was nearing the curve in the road now, the one that always made me uneasy. There was something about it, something that never felt right, like the road had a life of its own. I pushed my foot down on the accelerator, wanting to get through it as quickly as possible. But just as I entered the curve, the headlights flickered. Once, then again. I cursed under my breath, slamming the dashboard in frustration. The headlights blinked out, and for a moment, I was plunged into total darkness. The car coasted along, the engine barely humming. My heart was in my throat, my palms slick on the steering wheel. Just when I thought I was going to be swallowed. By the dark, the headlights came back on, revealing the road ahead. I let out a shaky breath, but then I saw it again. The figure. This time it was standing right in the middle of the road. I slammed the brakes, the tires screeching in protest. The car stopped just inches from the figure, which stood perfectly still. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark silhouette against the headlights. I couldn't breathe. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and for a split second I thought I might pass out. Then the figure stepped back. Slowly, deliberately. It didn't run, didn't turn. It simply retreated into the woods, fading into the shadows. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the spot where it had stood. My mind raced with questions. Was it real? Was I hallucinating? Was I just too tired to trust what I'd seen? I shook my head and forced myself to drive on, the road seeming more hostile with every passing moment. The trees felt like they were closing in. The shadows felt deeper, but there was no figure behind me anymore. No sound, no movement. Just the road, the car, and the crushing weight of the night. When I finally reached the edge of the woods and could see the lights of the town in the distance, I didn't look back. I didn't dare. It was well past midnight when I found myself driving down an unfamiliar stretch of highway. I had been on the road for hours, heading back from a business trip. The endless, dark highway stretched out in front of me, lit only by my headlights, and the occasional street lamp that appeared like a distant ghost in the rearview mirror. The radio crackled with static, the only sound filling the silence. I adjusted it, hoping to hear something normal, but it was just more static, more nothing. The whole night had felt off from the start, like the world had fallen into a kind of dreamless quiet. The road ahead was empty. No cars, no lights, just me, the road, and the black expanse of trees that lined the sides. It was a familiar scene, one I had driven many times, but tonight something felt wrong. I tried to shake off the feeling. It was just my mind playing tricks, right? A long drive, the exhaustion starting to weigh on me. I yawned, rubbing my eyes when I saw it. A car. It was a few hundred feet ahead, just sitting there on the side of the road, its lights off. I felt my heart skip a beat. Why would someone be parked in the middle of nowhere at this hour? I slowed down as I approached, ready to keep going, but something made me pause. I couldn't explain why, but I felt a strange pull, an instinct to stop. Turned the wheel and pulled over beside the car, careful not to get too close. The eerie quiet of the night settled around me like a blanket, pressing in from all sides. I hesitated, then stepped out, my boots crunching on the gravel as I walked toward the parked vehicle. There was no one in it. The car was empty. I looked around, but the highway was still deserted. No other lights, no signs of life. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped closer to the vehicle. The windows were rolled down, but there were no personal items in sight. The air felt oddly still, the only sound my own breathing. I reached for the door handle, drawn by a strange curiosity, but then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint, but unmistakable. It seemed to come from the trees, a voice low and barely audible. Go. I froze. My hand hovered over the door handle and my breath caught in my throat. The whisper had come from the direction of the woods, the same woods that bordered the highway. My eyes darted toward the trees, but nothing moved. I swallowed hard, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Okay, no more, I muttered to myself. I turned and rushed back to my car, getting in as quickly as I could. My hands trembled as I started the engine, the roar of it breaking the silence. I checked my rearview mirror, but the empty car was gone. I took a deep breath, forcing my grip to steady on the wheel. Get a hold of yourself, I told myself. It's just the dark, just your imagination. I pulled back onto the road, eager to leave whatever had happened behind me. But as I drove, the road seemed to stretch on forever. A few miles down the highway, I saw it again. The car. It was now behind me. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as I looked in my mirror. The headlights shone in my face, and for a brief moment, the world felt like it was closing in around me. I could see no one in the car, just the headlights, glowing bright in my rearview mirror. My pulse quickened. I didn't want to stop, but I had no choice. The road was too narrow, and the headlights were closing in. I took a sharp right turn, down a winding dirt road that veered off the main highway. The car followed, its headlights still fixed on me. I drove faster, my hands gripped tightly on the wheel, but the other car stayed right behind me. No matter how fast I went, it was always there, just a few feet behind. The wind whistled through the trees, the tires kicked up dust, but all I could hear was the engine of the car, the sound of it getting closer and closer. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the car was gone. I slammed on the brakes again, spinning to a stop in the middle of the road. I looked behind me and the road was completely empty. The night was silent. I sat there for a long moment, my mind racing. What had just happened? There had been no other car, no one chasing me. But the feeling, the sensation of being watched, of being followed, lingered. I didn't stop driving again until I saw the lights of a gas station in the distance. By the time I pulled into the lot, I was a mess, shaken and sweating, unsure of what was real and what wasn't. I got out of my car and filled the tank, trying to convince myself that I had just imagined everything. But the silence of the night, the unsettling whispers and the headlights in my rearview mirror stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't over. I was on my way back from a work trip, somewhere deep in the countryside, miles from the nearest town. The GPS had long since given up on me, the signal cutting out hours ago. The only thing left was the winding road ahead and the occasional flicker of my car's dashboard lights. It wasn't unusual to be alone out here. In fact, it was expected. This part of the world was quiet, almost abandoned. I wasn't exactly sure where I was anymore. The signposts had all faded from the wear of time, and the only markers were the occasional dilapidated fence posts or crooked trees. But my car was still running, the engine humming steadily, and I just kept going. That's when I saw it. A shadow, low to the ground, moving at the edge of my headlights. My heart skipped a beat, but I dismissed it quickly. It was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or deer. But then, I saw it again. This time, it was right by the road, just ahead. Something large, hunched over, with pale skin that glinted in the brief light from the car's headlights. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out the details, but its shape was unmistakable. And the movement. It was like it was gliding. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the road. I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, but all I saw were the faint shadows of the trees and the blackness beyond. My breath was shallow now, my hands trembling. On the steering wheel, there was nothing there. I looked behind me, half expecting to see something or someone in the rearview mirror, but the road was empty. Just as silent as it had been. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. It had been a long day, and I was exhausted. I glanced at the clock, nearly 3 a.m. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the unease that had suddenly crept into my chest. I put the car in gear and continued driving. The only sound, the hum of the engine and the soft thud of my tires against the asphalt. But even though the night felt still, there was something else, something lurking just outside the glow of my headlights, waiting. As I drove, I started to feel it, the sensation that I wasn't alone in the car. I couldn't explain it at first, but there was a heaviness in the air, like someone was watching me. I turned to look in the back seat, half expecting to see someone sitting there, but the seat was empty. I laughed to myself nervously. I was just imagining things. It was the isolation getting to me. The quiet was playing tricks on my mind. Then I heard it, a faint tapping. Soft at first, like the sound of a fingernail against glass. It came from the back window, just behind my seat. I froze. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to confirm what I was already terrified of knowing. The sound came again, louder this time. Tapping, tapping, tapping. I felt my stomach tighten into a knot. Slowly, my hand moved to the rearview mirror. I couldn't see anything behind me, but the tapping continued. My foot pressed down on the gas pedal, the car accelerating faster than I meant it to. I wanted to get away from whatever was back there. But the sound, the tapping, didn't stop. It kept growing louder, faster, as if something was moving closer. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The car fell into an eerie silence. I looked into the rearview mirror again. Nothing. For a moment, I convinced myself that it had just been the wind or a branch scraping against the window. But I didn't believe it. Then, a shape appeared in the mirror. A figure, pale, translucent, and distorted, standing just outside my window. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, the car speeding up to an even more dangerous pace. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stayed there, watching. I kept driving, my hands clenched tightly on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I wasn't sure if I was hallucinating or if something was genuinely out there, but my heart raced, and I couldn't bring myself to look back again. It wasn't until I reached the nearest gas station, a dimly lit oasis in the night, that I dared to stop. My hands were shaking as I turned off the engine. The night felt colder now, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I stepped out of the car, glancing nervously around. The station was deserted, the only light coming from a flickering bulb overhead. I walked quickly inside, my legs feeling like they might give way beneath me. The attendant looked up from his newspaper. "Long drive?" he asked, his voice soft. Nodded, trying to mask the unease in my voice. "Yeah, you wouldn't believe what I saw out there." The sky was pitch black, save for the occasional flash of lightning off in the distance. My fingers tapped anxiously on the steering wheel, the rhythmic sound of the wipers sweeping back and forth the only noise accompanying the hum of the engine. Had been driving for hours. Alone. I just finished visiting some family and was on my way back home. The roads should have been familiar, but tonight, everything felt different. The air was thick with tension, and every time I glanced in my rearview mirror I could swear I saw something following me, just beyond the light of my headlights. But when I looked again, there was nothing. It wasn't unusual for me to drive at night, long drives were my thing, but tonight felt off. The sense of being watched was unbearable. My mind kept racing, trying to push away the thoughts that crept into my head. What if someone was out there? I shook my head, trying to focus on the road. "Just keep going," I muttered to myself. "Just get home." That's when I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing by the side of the road. I slowed down, squinting. It was too dark to make out any details, but I saw the vague shape of a person. A man, standing motionless, facing the road. His posture was unnerving, like he was waiting for something. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't stop. The rational part of me told me to keep driving. The last thing I wanted to do was pull over on a deserted highway in the middle of nowhere. But as I passed, I couldn't help but glance in the side mirror. The figure hadn't moved. I tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered in my gut, like an ominous weight that refused to let go. I pressed the gas pedal a little harder, eager to put some distance between me and whatever that was, but the road stretched on, and the darkness felt deeper now. The headlights barely cut through it. Then, about 20 minutes later, I saw something else. Another figure. This time they were standing in the middle of the road. Their body was a dark silhouette against the night sky. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the wet road. For a second, everything went silent. No rain, no wind, just an unnatural stillness. I felt my heart race, my pulse thumping in my ears. I honked my horn, but the figure didn't flinch. It just stood there, frozen. I wasn't about to get out of the car. Not for this. Not with the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The car jerked forward slightly as if something invisible was pushing me forward. I tried to drive around the figure, but as I did, I saw the reflection of the same man in my side mirror, his face, pale and twisted, staring back at me. I snapped my head around, but he was gone. I exhaled shakily, hands gripped tightly on the wheel. My breath came out in short gasps as I sped up again, desperate to escape whatever was happening. The next hour was a blur of tension. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. The road felt like it was stretching, on forever, each minute heavier than the last. The unease in my chest was suffocating. Then came the most terrifying part of the night. I noticed the headlights of another car approaching from behind. The bright beams cut through the darkness, and I felt a slight relief at the thought of another person being on the road. Maybe they'd pull up beside me and I wouldn't feel so alone. But the car never passed. Instead, it stayed right behind me. It was close, too close. I glanced in my mirror again. The headlights were right there, too bright, but there was no other car, no one, just the lights. I slammed my foot on the gas, the engine roaring to life, but the lights stayed with me, just behind my car. No matter how fast I went, no matter how many turns I made, the lights stayed locked on me. My hands trembled on the wheel. I swerved to the side of the road, desperate to pull over, but when I did, the lights stayed on, hovering in the mirror. I gripped the steering wheel, staring ahead, feeling a cold sweat form on my brow. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the car's headlights vanished. The road was empty again. I didn't dare look back. The next hour seemed to stretch on forever. I didn't stop. I didn't look behind me. I just drove, through the rain, through the night, until, finally, I reached my exit. The familiar lights of my neighborhood greeted me, and only then did I let out a shaky breath, finally feeling the tension lift. I parked in my driveway and quickly rushed into my house, locking the door behind me. But as I sat in my living room, trying to calm my racing heart, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that something, or someone, was out there in the dark, waiting for me to take the road again. It was one of those nights where everything felt wrong. The air was thick with tension, even though there was no reason for it. The car hummed steadily beneath me, the tires rolling over the long stretch of empty highway. Just me, my old sedan, and the road stretching endlessly ahead. The only light was from the headlights cutting through the inky blackness, illuminating nothing but the road and the occasional shadow from the trees that lined it. I was coming back from a late meeting, and the roads were nearly empty, too empty for comfort. The kind of night where you expect a car to pass by every few minutes, but it's just you. I had driven this road hundreds of times, so I should have felt at ease, but tonight felt different. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, it seemed like something was behind me. But every time I looked, nothing was there. I brushed it off as my imagination, tired from a long day. But the unease lingered. I hadn't planned to take this route. The GPS had suggested an alternate, but for some reason I ignored it. The winding back roads felt familiar, too familiar. My mind kept drifting, lost in the rhythm of the car's engine and the darkness outside. The trees on either side of the road seemed to grow closer as I drove. I tried to focus on the road, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. It wasn't until I reached the old bridge that I realized something was very wrong. The bridge had been here for as long as I could remember. Old, rusty, creaky, but reliable. At least it used to be. Tonight it looked different. The road seemed to dip slightly before the bridge, almost as if it was shifting downward. The wooden planks creaked under the weight of my car, and I felt an odd shudder as I crossed. I didn't think much of it at first, that is, until I glanced at the rearview mirror again. This time, there was something moving behind me. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest. I whipped my head around to look out the back window. Nothing, just the empty stretch of road. But as I turned back, my heart skipped a beat. There was something in front of me now, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I was frozen, hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes wide with shock. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was wearing a tattered coat, standing completely still under the beam of my headlights. His face was hidden in shadows, but I could see enough to make out his shape. Tall, thin, motionless. My instincts screamed at me to go around him, but I couldn't move. I could only stare. "Hey," I shouted, trying to get his attention. "R, you okay? What are you doing out here?" No response. I honked the horn. Still, no movement. He was just standing there, staring into the darkness. I had no choice. Slowly, I eased my foot off the brake and started to inch forward. The figure didn't react. He didn't even look in my direction. The car moved forward, the tires crunching lightly on the gravel. I was going around him, but the strange feeling in my chest only grew heavier. That's when I saw it. As I passed him, he turned his head slowly. His eyes weren't the normal kind of eyes. They were too wide, too blank, hollow. He didn't blink. He didn't even look at me as I drove by, just kept staring straight ahead, his gaze never wavering. I hit the gas pedal. I was out of there, speeding down the road, heart racing. I couldn't shake the image of those hollow eyes from my mind. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel tighter, the car speeding faster than I'd intended. And then, I heard it, the soft sound of footsteps. Behind me, I whipped around, but there was nothing. No one. The road was empty. Was I imagining things? I couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror. My breath caught in my throat as I swerved around a sharp curve, fighting the wheel to stay steady. But then, for a split second, I saw something, moving in the reflection of the mirror. The figure. He was following me. I couldn't see him in front of me anymore, but he was there, behind me. His steps were silent, like he was gliding just out of view. My eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror, every instinct screaming at me to drive faster. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the darkness consuming everything. I pushed the accelerator, to the floor, desperate to get away from whatever was pursuing me. But no matter how fast I drove, the figure remained in the mirror, just behind me. Suddenly, I hit a sharp bend in the road, and without thinking, I slammed the brakes, sending the car into a skid. The tires screeched as I fought to regain control. Finally, I came to a stop, heart pounding in my chest. The car shook as I sat there, hands still gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I dared not look behind me. I just sat there, frozen, in place, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. No footsteps, no figure, just the silence of the empty road. It was late, far later than I intended to be out. The highway stretched on, long and desolate, with only the faint hum of my car's engine and the occasional flicker of the headlights cutting through the darkness. The town was miles behind me, and the next one wasn't due for another hour. I was on a small, empty stretch of road through the forest. I'd driven this route before, countless times, but tonight it felt different. The air seemed thicker, almost suffocating, and the silence outside the car was unsettling. I adjusted the rearview mirror, more out of habit than necessity. It was just me and the road. Just me. Or so I thought. At first I didn't notice it, but then, as I glanced to the side of the road, I saw a figure standing in the trees. A person. I slammed my foot down on the brake, heart pounding. The car jerked to a stop, and I turned my head sharply to look again. But there was nothing. Just the trees, the darkness, and the long stretch of road. I let out a shaky breath. Nothing. Maybe I was just seeing things. The tiredness from the long drive was getting to me, making me imagine things in the dark. Still, I hesitated. The road ahead was empty, too empty, and the figure I thought I saw couldn't have just disappeared that quickly. I told myself to relax. There was no one there. But as I slowly started driving again, I noticed something strange. The car headlights reflected off something ahead, not far off in the distance, just barely within view. A shape standing there. I braked again. My hands were clammy. I wasn't imagining this. I leaned forward, squinting. There it was, a figure, this time clearer, standing in the middle of the road. A man, his face hidden in the shadows, just standing there like he was waiting for me. His arms were stiff by his sides. His stance didn't seem natural. "Is this some kind of prank?" I muttered, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I should have driven past him. That's what I told myself. But the curiosity gnawed at me. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence. I rolled down the window slightly, just enough to shout, "Hey, are you okay?" No response. I waited, my heart drumming in my chest. This was ridiculous. If he was in trouble, I should help, right? But something told me to be cautious. Something felt off about this entire situation. Before I could decide what to do next, the man took a step back, slowly, almost deliberately, and disappeared into the trees. My breath caught, in my throat. Gone. Just like that. My mind raced. Should I check? Was someone out there waiting for me? Or had I imagined the whole thing? But then again, if someone had been standing there, where did he go? There were no other roads, no side paths, just the dense forest on either side of the highway. I could feel my hands tightening on the steering wheel. I didn't know what to do. The place felt like it was closing in on me. I needed to get moving. And that's when I heard it. A soft tap, knock, knock. I froze. It came from the passenger side. The sound was too close, too clear to be a figment of my imagination. My breath hitched in my throat as I turned slowly to look. There was nothing there. No one. But as I turned back to the road ahead, my eyes widened in terror. The figure, the same figure, was standing in the middle of the highway again, blocking my path. I wasn't imagining it. This time, I didn't stop. I couldn't. My foot slammed on the gas and I sped up, trying to race past him, my pulse hammering in my ears. Just as I neared the figure, I swear I saw his face, pale and expressionless, watching me with wide eyes. I didn't dare look back, to see if he was still there. I pressed the accelerator harder, ignoring the sound of my tires skidding on the road. The car surged forward, faster and faster, until I was far past the spot where he had been standing. The eerie silence returned. Didn't slow down until I reached the next town, where the lights and signs comforted me like a distant dream. My hands were shaking. I had to pull into a gas station just to breathe. I sat there for a moment, heart still racing, the engine idling, trying to make sense of what had happened. I checked the rearview mirror. Nothing. Just the empty stretch of road behind me. I never saw that figure again, and I never spoke about it to anyone. It wasn't until years later, when I came across a similar story in an online forum, that I realized I wasn't the only one, and maybe that's what scared me the most.